The Association of Consultants for Liturgical Space is a voluntary membership organization of professionals dedicated to the creation of beautiful worship spaces for faith communities. This webinar series is part of our commitment to providing mutual professional support and continuing education for our members. I'm Paul Barabo of Growth Design Group. I am the webinar facilitator for the ACLS Webinar Committee, and it is my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. Today's speaker is Sukey Bryan. Sukey is a painter, printmaker, and installation artist. She graduated from Yale University with a BA in Fine Art and English and with an MFA from the Maryland Institute. Sukey was the 2018 Artist in Residence at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco. She received grants from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Maryland Arts Council. Her work has been collected and exhibited widely in the United States at galleries, museums, academic and nonprofit exhibition spaces, at churches, and at American embassies in Russia, Fiji, Finland, and Norway. Sukey is based in Stanford, California. We'd like to welcome you, Sukey, and we are very interested in seeing what you have to show to us today.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Thank you so much for inviting me to share my work. So I thought I would share with you the first piece that I did for a liturgical space. This is called The Fire Within, and it's 12 panels. I created it to be used at Pentecost, so there's sort of the image, the symbolic image of the flame, and there are 12 of them, and they are about 1 foot wide and around 7 feet tall. And I painted them. They're in oil on canvas, which I then glued down onto panels. And my idea was to make a piece that I could share with different congregations, and it would be flexible and able to be used in a number of configurations to fit whatever the architecture of the space is. So the panels have an easel back, which I can use if I want to have them be freestanding, and then I can also take off that easel back and just use a wire on the back to hang them on walls. And since I've made this piece, I've shown it in a number of churches. This is Stanford Memorial Church, which is actually where I came up with the idea, kind of echoing the niches that run along the back of the church where they have candles usually lit. So in this case, I installed it in a semicircle, and I've shared this with churches mainly in the Bay Area, although I did drive them down to LA to the All Saints in Beverly Hills, the Episcopal Church. And in this situation, they actually removed the reredos and installed it, and I made it into a kind of straight line in that setting. And sometimes churches will keep them just for a short time, or other times they've been there for months and months. This installation was in a very kind of brutalist concrete interior, and I hung them on the wall, divided them into 2 groups of 6, and they kind of warmed the space up, which was really a nice effect. And the idea behind them is that they're a wildfire image, and I thought about, in addition to the symbol of a flame over the head of the apostles in the upper room, the idea of God's Spirit and the flame being our own kind of spiritual life that's fed by God. Just to back up a little bit about my work, I do work that's based on different natural elements. I'll do a series of paintings and prints. Usually I'll follow one subject over at least 6 and sometimes hundreds of images, and I'll focus in on one particular element, and I'm interested in the ways that the element is moved and changed and transformed by forces that are greater than it. I did a series of images looking at waves that were moved by seismic activity, and then I with the NEA grant, I went to Iceland and did work that had to do with volcanic activity and the creation of new land. A lot of my work is really large. This one is probably about 6 by 8 feet, and the prints tend to be smaller. I'll do etchings or monotypes. This is a piece called Suspire, and it is part of the wildfire series. I grew up on the East Coast and moved west about 20 years ago, and when we first got here, I would read about the wildfires in the fall and just thought, oh, that's a weird aberration, and then realized that, oh no, it's every year we have these wildfires, and they're like kind of the what happens in the East and the Midwest in the fall, where there's that cleaning out of the landscape and a shutting down and then rejuvenation. So I did a whole series of paintings exploring fire with some of those ideas in mind, and also the way that flame is, in a way, echoes our own experience in that the flame requires oxygen like we do, and also consumes plant life, and we also consume materials for our sustenance. This one is about 4 by 4 feet. And then after the wildfire series, I did a series looking at the winter rains here, which are just come in a very short time, a couple months, doesn't rain at all the rest of the year, and then all of a sudden it really rains, comes down in these huge downpours. But it's also the time in the California landscape where the earth really comes back to life and there's new growth. I will also put my own kind of iconography or emotions in the work when I'm making it, like this painting, which is a real large piece. I did shortly after the death of my mother-in-law, and so I thought of those little rain marks as being kind of like tears, and it was a real cathartic way for me to channel some of my own grieving. And I thought a lot about the way that great love, the sort of other side of the coin, is the great loss that you feel, and to be able to sort of talk about issues that have to do with the environment and the way nature works, but also to put my own feelings, whatever is going on in my personal life or friends or the world, is really a wonderful thing. Then after the rain piece series, I did a shorter group of work that had to do with the grasses that grow in California that go from green in the winter to brown in the summer. A really recurrent image for me or subject matter is the ocean. I've done a lot of different pieces looking at ocean being moved by tides and weather, and these are about 4 by 6 feet oil paintings. And then in 2006, I got an artist residency through the National Park Service in Alaska. Most of the time, I'm just working right out of my home. I work out of the garage of our house on the Stanford campus. My husband's on the faculty, and I have a wonderful place to work, kind of nestled in the campus life. But this was a chance to go elsewhere, and it's a small program. Has about 4 artists in the summer, because they have such a short season when you can work and you get to live in this cabin. And I was interested in going so that I could see a glacier ecology. When I first got there, there was some instructions about closing the window shutters and the front door every night, and the doors and shutters had these nails sticking out of them, which was a little bit alarming, and they were to keep the grizzly bears out. So I made sure to do that. And it was really an amazing experience to be in a place that was so environmentally intact. I mean, every species is still there. And growing up in New York City, or outside of New York City, and in the San Francisco Bay Area, the land has been so transformed. I did mainly sketches, a little bit of work, full pieces there, but there was a lot of weather, even though it was August, including snow. And a lot of rain, so I ended up doing more research and photography. And this is one of the pieces that came out of it. This is in one of the visitor centers now up in Denali. And I looked at the whole glacier system from snow through the formation of the ice and to the melting with these glacier rivers that run through the valley, and also waterfalls. And I did just years and years of work, hundreds of pieces that had to do with the all the different parts of that system. This is a 3-panel piece. They're about, each panel is 4 by 4 feet, looking at these ice cliffs. This is actually farther south in Prince William Sound, and where the chunks calve off and float in the water. And this is an area where the glaciers come right down to the water. So by boat, you can come pretty close to the ice. And I did pieces where I would center the ice right in the middle, kind of like a still life, where I really wanted to make the viewer see the ice, and kind of realize the beauty and that these things exist in the world. This is my studio. You can kind of get a sense of the scale of my work. And I think of my brushwork as a kind of wordless way of speaking, kind of a wordless prayer. So for me, it really just the making of the work itself is a kind of a spiritual or religious practice. And I find that the more I do it, the more it opens up the colors. I feel like I can see more and more colors, and it's just gets to be more and more exciting the farther along I go. In the glacier series, as I moved along, I did paintings with smaller and smaller bits of ice, sort of kind of later in the season, in the summer when the ice breaks down to smaller bits, and also put more sky reflected in the water, especially evening sky, thinking about kind of an overlaying of sunset, end of the day, and end of the ice. And I was thinking about how this glacier system is a natural system, but it's being forced out of whack by the change in the air temperature with global climate change. And the ice is melting faster than it's having a chance to reform in snow on the tops of the mountains. So I decided to turn my attention to look more directly just at the sky, and ended up doing a series of monotypes and paintings based on just a patch of sky right over my backyard. So sort of the opposite of this faraway Alaska location. And I did prints and also paintings it happened to be right during the drought that we had here. So these puffy clouds that would float over my backyard and not rain. We just went through about 5 years of no rain. And during this time on the Stanford campus, they emptied all of the fountains to preserve water, and also to just sort of make people aware of the conservation that we had to be involved with in taking care of how much water use was happening in the dorms and homes. And I thought the fountain looked really unattractive. This is sort of an iconic fountain in front of the bookstore on campus, and I had an idea of filling it with a painting. So I worked with undergraduates. We took over a dining hall for a weekend and painted a painting which fits within the fountain. The fountain's about 40 feet across. It's actually kind of bigger than it looks in this picture. And just laid it there. I was not able to use any kind of glue or anything. It had to be just laid in the bottom, and was installed for a couple of weeks. The campus gets tons of tourists, so it actually ended up being seen a lot, and which was wonderful. And I worked with students that were not necessarily art students, just regular undergrads, and I sort of taught them how to do this. These are some kids that were making a movie in it. And then I did my next piece that I thought of that could be used for liturgical spaces. This is 2 cloud banners that I painted on a polyester type of canvas. So they're able to be rolled up, and my thought was this would be something that could be mailed or UPS to different locations, and set up more easily than the panel piece, the fire panel piece. And this is installed in a church in New York City. And the symbolism is more open. I felt it could be used for any number of parts of the Christian calendar. In this case, it was used for Easter. Then I did another piece where I did a huge painting on canvas and cut it out into a circle, kind of echoing a globe, except that it's an image of sky and clouds. And I have installed that on a temporary basis, different locations around where I live. This is on a campus, high school, girls' high school campus. And then I also installed it in the Clark Center, which is a science building on the Stanford campus for Earth Day. And at this point, Grace Cathedral approached me and asked if I could do something with the fountain that they have in their courtyard, like what I did at Stanford. And their fountain was really small, and I didn't see that I could really work with it in that kind of way. But I came up with this other idea of working with their front steps and putting a sky image on the steps. And in trying to work out how the image could be used, I decided to make a model out of Legos, since I have a ton of Legos up in the attic for my two boys, because it's tricky. The image goes back in space but also up in space, and I wanted to have a way to lay it out to see how the diagonals were going to work, because all the images get really stretched out vertically. And I ended up taking an image from a photograph from my backyard, just like I had been doing all the paintings and prints, and printed it out on strips and used wheat paste to attach them to the front of the steps. And here's my glue crew friends who helped install it. And it was installed for Earth Day and Easter up at Grace Cathedral, which that year, like this year actually, were just about at the same time. So it was neat to see the imagery kind of be used both for Easter, and then a week later it morphed kind of right into Earth Day. And it's on the face of the steps so they don't get stepped on, but it is still just paper. So it was temporary, and it lasted a couple of weeks for this one. There it is. It rained on Easter, so it had a little bit of a tough start with the rain. And it got picked up in some of the media, and actually ended up being put in The Economist in this article about the church becoming more outspoken about and active on issues in the environment. And I happen to live on a street on the Stanford campus with a lot of economists, so I got a lot of teasing about how come you get to be in The Economist, you artist? So that was fun. And Grace Cathedral then asked me to do another project with them. They had a construction fence on the back of the church while they were renovating some of the stained glass windows. And I worked with a Sunday school and did a mural of a river rushing down over rocks, kind of blew it up so that the rocks are large scale. And I wanted to use something that would have the sense of gravity, because this is one of those steep San Francisco hills, so kind of this river rushing down the hill. And so these were my little artist friends, so obviously I had to do a lot of the top part, and this is how it turned out. It was a fun project. I particularly liked having a little bit of water coming out of the wall on the back corner there. And this stayed up for, I think, about 8 or 9 months while the construction was going on. And this is another piece that came around this period where an Episcopal church in Los Altos, California, asked me to do a temporary piece on their reredos to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the building of their church. That's my husband, who helps me out from time to time, which is nice. And the church itself is kind of shaped like a boat, so I decided to use a water image with kind of the idea that they're launching into the next part of their voyage. And I printed out an image of a photograph that I had taken of ocean ripples, and printed it in these strips, and then assembled it with just double stick tape behind it. And it was there for a couple of months. The church has beautiful Gabrielle Loire stained glass windows, so I really enjoyed trying to come up with an image that would work in terms of color and scale with those beautiful windows. And I also worked with there's a school that's associated with this church. So I worked with this students, an elementary school, and we did finger painted ocean creatures and hung them from the entrance of the church. And then I was approached by Grace Cathedral to be their artist in resident for 6 months, and they asked me to do work that had to do with the environment. There was going to be, in the end of that period, the Global Action Climate Summit in San Francisco that Governor Jerry Brown had kind of spearheaded, and the Episcopal Church really wanted to make a contribution to that and a statement and kind of house some of the lectures and different meetings that were going on at that time. And then they also had a big multi-faith service. And so my residency started on Earth Day and ended on that Global Action Climate Summit period. And the first piece, they wanted me to do my own work and then also as many group projects as I could fit in. So the first thing I decided to do was another stair piece, and this time I wanted to try and do something on the corner of the steps, which was bigger and also kind of a little bit more irregular in the way it was formed. I used the Legos again and decided to use an image of a waterfall called Bernie Falls, which is up near Shasta in California. I needed a really wide image and with a variety of dark and light so that it would show on the steps, because this one was going to have kind of less color in a way than the sky steps piece. And this is called Water Without. This is the installation of that piece, if I can get it to work. There we go. And again, I had a group of volunteers help me install it. It was a much bigger project. And I, again, printed it out on these strips and used wheat paste to glue it up. It was for Earth Day. And this one, we didn't have rain at all. So it actually lasted for, I think it was about 5 weeks. So a lot longer. And it was really visible from both traffic driving by and pedestrians. Grace Cathedral's on the top of a hill in San Francisco, and it's very prominent. It has a lot of tourists and visitors and a big congregation, really varied congregation. So there it is installed, close up. And then the next thing I decided to do was work with they also have a school that's associated with the cathedral, a boys' school. And I decided to do a project with them that would involve all the students. I had them work on a material called shrinky-dink, which some of you might be familiar with. It's a plastic sheet that you can paint or draw on and put it in the oven, and it shrinks down. So each boy had a shrinky-dink piece about 8 by 10 in size, and we used acrylic and pencil. And I wanted to use their logo as their mascot as a hawk. So they could do a drawing of anything having to do with a hawk, and we talked about its physical attributes, its environment, prey, its nests, its young, and they could do anything that they wanted having to do with the kind of life of a hawk. Here are some of the pieces that they did. They're just fantastic. Then I shrunk them down and assembled them in a mobile in the shape of a hawk, with the idea of the interconnectedness of nature, all these different aspects of the hawk's life coming together, and also the idea that each person contributing a small part can add up to a much larger whole. And that really is an idea that I came back to in kind of any way I could in the group projects at Grace Cathedral. I want the idea that, anything that you contribute can add up to a greater whole if you have a community that's working together. I also showed the fire panels again at Grace Cathedral for Pentecost. Ended up mainly moving them around in a lot of different locations. They have a lot of different services and types of service. So this is at the main altar. And I hung them from the balcony in the back, and I had them around the baptism font. And this was probably my favorite installation. They have a little tiny chapel called Chapel of Grace, and they just happen to fit in those little niches. And then it gets to the summer, and in July, during National Ocean Month, I did a number of different pieces that had to do with the ocean, and so that on the campus there was a different experiences having to do with ocean or celebrating the ocean. And the first thing I did was worked with the preschool and had them do finger painting about the ocean, which they completely loved. As you can see, this little boy is just completely in a trance. He's enjoying it so much. And they did pieces that got kind of so full of color that they were a little bit on the brown side. So I ended up calling it just Impressions of the Ocean on the little plaque that describes their artwork. But then amazingly, over the time that they were up, the sun bleached out the brown color and they ended up looking very blue oceany, and their drawings came out more strongly, which was just fantastic. I also put up some banners of my own photography along the columns of the courtyard at Grace Cathedral, and then over one weekend I did an public participation piece called where we worked with chalk, and I took masking tape and marked out the shape of humpback whales and sharks and rays and turtles at life size to their actual dimensions, and then invited people to fill them in any way they wanted. I had chalk and chalk paint, and I had ended up having hundreds of people participate, people that were associated with the church, but then also a lot of tourists that I accosted as they walked by and asked them if they wanted to help out. And they ended up just being fantastic, full of all these different patterns and words. And this is a picture from above. And I wanted people to kind of have an opportunity to celebrate these amazing creatures in the ocean, and also to get a sense of the scale when you see it kind of laid out and you're walking across it. They're just so enormous. And this was just over a Sunday afternoon, and they ended up staying for, I think, maybe 2 or 3 weeks, and then we host them off. Another group project that I did was these ceramic wave pieces. I did the ceramics, and they are kind of these plaque with a little bit of a wave shape on them, and had them available for people to help glaze, either as a part of a service or after services. And with this piece and all of the public and group participation pieces, I try to figure out a way to limit the choices so that people don't feel afraid that they don't have enough skill, or sort of hold back out of feeling like they don't know what decision to make. And at the same time, try and make it open enough so that they feel like they are actually can relax and create and participate and enjoy it. So in this case, I had really limited number of colors, so that was kind of predetermined, and then but they could make any kind of marks they wanted to. I invited people to kind of say a prayer for the ocean, or meditate, or sort of think about Thanksgiving for everything that the ocean brings to the world. And people seem to really enjoy it. I think folks don't get that much of a chance to create and to use their hands. And maybe there was something too about painting over a 3D object that was new and enjoyable. So here on the left is one of the pieces that was ready to go into the kiln, and that's on the right is how it turned out. And I ended up stacking them and putting them in niches by the front door of the cathedral, which they had not used before, those spaces. They were there for about 6 months, I'd say. And I called the piece Stacked Waves. Here's a closer up. And then the final piece that I did having to do with the ocean at this time was one of my own works. This is a oil painting called Waterfront, and it's a 5-panel piece. This is how it ended up looking. And I installed it inside the cathedral, and that's still up. And then I moved on to pieces that were really designed to be a part of that the summit, the Global Action Summit. And one of my ideas was to do a piece for inside the cathedral. I ended up printing up photographs that I took of black oak leaves, that's an indigenous California native tree, but it has a very classic kind of oak leaf look, and printed them. I think they were 33 feet long. This is my hallway. I kind of take over more and more of my house with my artwork. And then we installed them on the columns of the cathedral. And it was called Green Fuse. And my idea was I wanted to enlarge the leaves to the point where you kind of feel like you're an insect or a little bug on the leaves. And with the idea that these very ubiquitous kind of elements in our nature are so hugely important to our lives and the running of the ecosystem. This is a picture of the actual multi-faith service that the cathedral hosted. It had all kind of major religions and minor religions. And they had some people on stilts dressed up as trees as part of the service. It was really wonderful, all kinds of different types of music. This was a picture that I happened to find in the AAA magazine Via on things to do in San Francisco. So it ended up turning up there, curiously. I also was asked to do some banners for the multi-faith service itself. And with these, they wanted me to do very kind of practical elements having to do with environmental action, which was really a challenge. So they were like sustainable agriculture and sustainable transportation, caring for the earth, and sustainable energy. And I made these thinking about the G's Bend quilts, which use such amazing mixtures of fabrics. So kind of taking a small hint from them. They're really just beautiful, but and then trying to work with kind of the classic symbols that we have for those aspects of action. And each major religion processed in from different parts of the cathedral and used one of those banners at the beginning of the procession. And for the outside of the cathedral during the Global Summit, I used an image of NASA's image of the Earth and printed up banners that were about 30 feet long and 8 feet wide over the rose window. And my initial idea was to completely cover the rose window, and then there were logistic problems of doing that. And the second version of doing these 2 banners, I ended up really preferring. I feel like it's more open-ended into what it means and open to interpretation. I had to use help for the installation of this piece as well as the column because it ended up being too complicated to get up that high. I thought initially I could do it myself, but I had riggers help install it. And this ended up really being a piece that the local media used a lot when they were filming the reporting on the Global Summit. So that ended up being wonderful. And the Episcopal Church really wanted to show that faith and religious groups are an important and a vital part of caring for the earth and the environmental action that we're all having to be involved with climate change. So it was really wonderful that it got used in this way. This is the end of the service. The service ended up having the Dalai Lama was patched in with Skype, and there was representatives from the Vatican and all different religions. Here it is at sunset. And that was kind of the end of my time at Grace Cathedral for that artist residency. And then I got my work ended. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot one other thing. I also had an installation in their downstairs kind of gallery space of some of the glacier pieces, which are actually, those are still up. And then I ended up doing some pieces that came right out of the artist residency at Grace Cathedral. This is at the Palo Alto Art Center, so actually in my town here. They asked if I would do some artwork having to do with sky, and they have an exhibition on sky in the interior gallery space. And I used this kind of architectural feature, very California kind of Mondrian wooden decorative thing on the side of the building, and filled it with an image of the sky. And the thing that was interesting to me is that people said, oh, it reminds me of a church and it reminds me of stained glass windows. So that was kind of interesting to see that connection. I also did a piece on the back of the art center using, again, this just wooden facade that has this feel of windows, and put an image of the sky in it. And for me, I feel like I don't see too much of a difference between putting a piece in a church and in other places. And then this is the final piece that I thought I'd share with you. I just got finished installing this. It's a ocean installation at the Berkeley Environmental Center called the David Brower Center. And I printed up these images of water. These photographs were actually taken in Nia Bay up in Washington State. And I installed them around the entire building. The building is also kind of oval in shape. And this is the front door of the Brower Center. And I can run this movie. This is kind of a walk around the building. And this again was just temporarily glued up onto the concrete side of the building, and it'll hopefully last a couple months, and I may have to repair bits of it. And there are ideas of sea rise, but with all of my work, I want for people to feel really connected to nature, and to see ourselves in nature and nature in us, and to feel that connection. It's so kind of overwhelming to think about what we're facing in terms of the climate, and I want us to feel like hopeful and encouraged and motivated by love and not fear, and by a feeling like this is, you know, our own world, our own selves that we're protecting as stewards of the earth. And I think that the church has such a huge part to play in that, because so much of what we're called to do is with these problems that are not really going to be completely solvable, like poverty, and there are things where we just have to try to chip away and do whatever we can on the small scale and the large scale. So I feel like to work in that kind of areas makes a lot of sense. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Sukey, for sharing what I think is really beautiful and creative work, and particularly with interacting with people in the creation of it, and then having it available to stimulate discussion about religion and liturgy, and also concerns for the climate. We'll now open up the webinar to questions and discussions. I would remind our listeners to use the question box for any questions that you might have. And you may also use the raise hand feature if you wish to make a comment or a follow-up question. We're using a live webcam today so that you can see Sukey and during the question and answer period. And you can adjust the size of the webcam image by pulling down on the bar between the top and bottom halves of the screen or enlarging the webcam image. So with that, if you have questions, please send them and I will read them, and we'll allow Sukey some time to respond to your questions. I do have a question about, it seems like a lot of your pieces are temporary, Sukey, and
Yes.
And I'm assuming that that's partly because they are interactive, both in the creation and then in the experience of them. Do you have, or what percentage do you have of pieces that are permanent versus temporary, or are the majority of your pieces just temporary work?
So the installations that I've done have all been temporary. My paintings and prints that I show in galleries and I sell are sort of separate, and those are permanent. But the installations I've made so far have all been just these temporary pieces. And I kind of like the freedom that gives me. There's always a kind of experimental aspect. I'm not really sure how well things are going to work or how long they'll last. And by making them temporary, it gives me a lot of latitude to try kind of these bigger ideas and in unusual spaces, and then just see how they turn out.
It seems to me that there may be some benefit too in that so much of the discussion now about global warming and climate change is almost like a clock ticking, and maybe the temporal aspect of your pieces gives a different kind of urgency that things aren't always going to be with us in quite the same way.
Yeah, I think there is something that feels right about having these things that are just up for a little bit and then go away. And I think it may have to do with what you just said. And I also like having these things that are very like large and physical that people can really viscerally experience and get pulled into, and in places that they're not, especially kind of discarded parts of buildings, parts that you wouldn't normally even necessarily notice, and to bring them alive in a way and engage people, and hopefully sort of give them some joy and some surprise, and sense of connection.
So when you work with a particular artist or a particular client, do you do upfront work with liturgists when that's a liturgical area, or how do you interact with staff or people that are designing liturgy to understand kind of parameters and the sensibilities of how your artwork will interact with the people who will then be doing rite and ritual?
So, so far I've mainly, I haven't gotten involved in the liturgy at all myself. A lot of times I'll propose an idea or two to a church. Like for Grace, I would put together a proposal with maybe 2 or 3 different ideas for different spaces or different imagery, and then they would select it. And so it's more kind of taking my own imagery and letting the church do what they want with it in terms of liturgy. And same with the panels, I'll send an image and describe what they are to a church, and if they want to use them, then I'll go and install them. But in terms of what they do with it, how the service works, I have not gotten involved in that.
So we have a couple questions from one of our members who began his first question with incredible imagery and the large
Oh,
scale.
thanks.
As designers of sacred spaces, we have both artists and consultants that are involved in the formation of that. What architecture elements assist you with your creations, such as niches with the art tile waves? And do you find things in the architecture that you work with that inspire the creation or the creation of pieces?
Yeah, I love kind of looking around at a space and feeling how it works. And but a lot of times I like to not work with a part of an architecture that is really successful and doesn't need anything. I'll more opt for a part of the architecture that isn't as used or isn't as noticeable or as successful. I mean, the exception to that would be the steps of Grace Cathedral, which are just incredibly impactful on their own. But otherwise, I like even the niches in Grace Cathedral where I put the waves. There's so much going on with that facade that you wouldn't necessarily even notice those as a feature. So I love pulling out an area and taking advantage of it and putting something new in it and bringing it to attention.
So the follow-up or the second question that was asked was, having been an artist in residence for a cathedral, are there suggestions that you would have for other churches as they set up similar types of programs?
Well, I guess I could say what was really fantastic about working with Grace is that they had some money to support it, which was nice. I mean, a lot of the work that I've done with churches, I've just done, without any funding. So I've used my own sales of my paintings and prints to kind of support my religious outreach, I guess you could say. And Grace Cathedral has a small foundation, I think, that supports their artist residency. So my expenses, which I kept as low as possible, were covered, and then I even had a small stipend, and that was super nice. And then I was just really supported through the process with help with getting volunteers for different activities and outreach and timing of things, helping with scheduling. So the woman who runs their art program is really wonderful, Rebecca Nessel. And then, yeah, I suppose it just depends on the church and what they're looking for. I really loved that I would kind of present ideas and then they would choose. I mean, for me, that ended up being like I knew that the direction that I wanted to go in was the direction that the church wanted to go in as well. So I don't know if that helps at all.
So another of our members noted that he just started working with arts in New York City, and he heard that they were hoping to have you come and do an installation. He says, "I love the idea of engaging people in taking part in the creating. I wonder if you've created any work around the stories of the Easter Vigil. Obviously, the elements work superbly with the creation story."
Yeah, I haven't really, but that is a good idea. A lot there, a lot to work with. So, I mean, that's one of the things that I love about doing this is I feel like there's just one thing leads to the next, and there's so many ways to use the faith and the natural imagery together. So I'm not sure what will be next, but.
And while you were answering that, he noted, "I'd love to collaborate." So his name is Dent Davidson, and he's been with us all along the presentation today.
Okay.
And then another member asking or noting that this isn't really a question, but he notes that your work seems to transcend and embrace the liturgical and the secular, but are so embracing to religious ideas, love, and embracing the world.
Thank you. yeah, I feel like it's that my faith is such a part of every piece I do. I mean, it really is like a way for me to pray, and I always hope that that gets, sort of embedded in it, and that people can sort of feel that in some way or get something out of it for themselves.
So I was fascinated by the work that you showed that were the kids doing ocean pieces that started out in rust, and then the reds bleached out, and it
Yeah.
actually turned into kind of a vivid blue. Um, I'm assuming that was intentional. Although as an architect, I know that there are many things that happen in buildings that people assume we take credit for having intentionally created, that I look at and say, nope, that was a complete surprise and still delightful. Was that in fact a part of design or a surprise? And if so, where have you found other surprises, that things that were unintended of your installations that actually brought either beauty or maybe not so nice surprises out of the installations?
Yes, so that was absolutely a surprise. In fact, if you'd asked me, I would have thought the blues would have been more fugitive and kind of been affected by the sun. Um, and I was like perfectly fine with them being murky because the ocean can be murky, but it was really just cool that, I mean, not only the blue, but also that their little drawings of fish kind of became more vivid as the time went by. Um, yeah, that was really the best surprise that I've had, I have to say. I mean, sometimes it will be like just the way, like the stairs piece of the waterfall, like the way that when you walked around it, the image changed and moved. That even with my high-tech Lego model, I still didn't anticipate like exactly how it would work. And um, the green fuse piece, the oak leaves, I mean, I was definitely going for a sense of forest with using the columns as kind of that idea of the trunks of trees, but it just felt more that it's a huge space, and I wasn't sure how much those would register because the banners themselves were only 24 inches wide. Um, and I was hoped that they wouldn't, disappear too much within kind of and it's a dark space, but they really were vibrant enough and gave a sense of a forest. So that was a real, um, that went like better than I had hoped, I guess. So that was a nice surprise.
So we have another member, Marilyn Morgan, who I think you know,
Yes.
are aware of, asks, are you aware of churches having conversations about your installations, such as more emphasis or more conversation sparked by your art on climate change?
I don't know if I can answer that exactly. I've just noticed a real, interest in hearing about my work and an openness to it and support, encouragement. So, and invitations to, give talks, that kind of thing. So, I think that everyone is really thinking so much about um, the earth and the work that we need to do, and this sort of like speaks to what's on people's minds maybe already.
So, obviously you're inspired by the creation around you and what you see in the world around you. Are there artists or are there what inspires you? What sorts of things, beyond the natural order? Where have you found inspiration from other artists or from churches that you've interacted with?
Um, I am inspired by there's sort of a short list of painters that I look to a lot. from Rembrandt is my absolute favorite, and Monet, Joan Mitchell, who's American abstract expressionist, Van Gogh. But then I also really like Bill Viola, the video artists, and there are a number of photographers that I like. These two artists named the Starn Twins, which are out of Boston. But then I also will listen to music. Sometimes I'll be thinking about different poetry, poems, or plays, or different things that I've read when I'm working. So I kind of will have a lot of different things that I bring to my my studio when I'm working that I'll have in my mind. I have a dance background. I grew up doing a lot of ballet, and so I'll work to music, and I feel like the sense of kind of movement and gesture and rhythm is kind of just such a part of the way I think creatively that I think that affects my work a lot.
Great. So we are just about out of time. I want to thank you so much, Sukey, for your beautiful pieces and for your willingness to share them with us and engage in the conversation of how kind of interactive and temporary art can become a part of our architecture and liturgy. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
I'm going to remind our listeners or our participants, if you stay logged in long enough, a survey will appear at the end of the webinar, or you can wait for one to arrive by email. Either way, it's very helpful for the webinar committee to have your feedback via the survey. Our next presenter on March 19th is going to be David Philippart. There you will be receiving information on the ACLS website and by email fairly shortly about that presentation. Thank you all for attending. I'm looking forward to seeing as many of you as we can get at the next webinar. And again, thank you, Sukey, for your inspiring and beautiful work.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.